Right now, agriculture underlies essentially everything about modern human civilization, cities, complex social organization, and virtually every other significant marker of human societal development connect directly back to this single foundational transition. But the actual story of exactly when and how humans first invented agriculture turns out to be considerably more gradual and considerably more geographically distributed than the popular, simplified narrative most people have probably encountered. Let's dig into this properly because the answer involves independent development across multiple, completely separate regions. And it reveals a truly fascinating pattern worth exploring in real depth. Let's start with the basic timeline worth establishing clearly up front because it represents the necessary starting point for this whole broader topic. Agriculture first developed roughly 12,000 years ago, with the earliest confirmed evidence coming from the region researchers commonly refer to as the Fertile Crescent, spanning parts of the modern Middle East, where early humans began deliberately cultivating specific wild grain species, including early forms of wheat and barley. Rather than relying purely on hunting and gathering wild food sources as humans had exclusively done throughout the entirety of our species' previous evolutionary history. This detail is worth sitting with directly because it means agriculture represents an extraordinarily recent development when measured against the full span of human evolutionary history, already explored extensively in other discussions regarding early human origins and development. Anatomically modern humans existed for well over 200,000 years before anyone anywhere developed agriculture, meaning the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history unfolded entirely without farming, relying instead on hunting and gathering as the sole means of acquiring food. Let's talk about why agriculture developed when it did, rather than considerably earlier in human history, because this represents an important, actively researched question worth exploring in additional depth. Researchers generally point to a combination of factors converging around this specific historical period, including the end of the last ice age and the resulting climate stabilization, which created more predictable, favorable growing conditions in various specific regions, alongside gradually increasing human population density in certain favorable regions, which likely created growing practical pressure toward more intensive, reliable food production methods compared to purely opportunistic hunting and gathering. This detail helps explain why agriculture didn't develop earlier, despite humans clearly possessing sufficient cognitive capability and technical skill to potentially manage basic plant cultivation for a considerable stretch of our species' prior evolutionary history. The specific combination of environmental and demographic circumstances needed to actually make agriculture a practically favorable choice compared to established hunting and gathering practices apparently didn't reliably occur until this specific historical period. Roughly 12,000 years ago, meaning the underlying capability likely existed considerably earlier, while the specific circumstances actually favoring its practical development and adoption emerged somewhat later. Let's talk about independent agricultural development occurring across multiple separate regions too, because this represents perhaps the single most important, most consistently underappreciated aspect of this entire broader topic worth exploring in considerable additional depth. Agriculture didn't develop just once, in the Fertile Crescent specifically, before spreading outward to the rest of the world. Researchers have confirmed agriculture developed independently in at least several completely separate regions, including China, where early humans independently domesticated rice and millet, Mesoamerica, where early humans independently domesticated maize, beans, and squash, and parts of South America, where early humans independently domesticated potatoes and other crops, each of these separate agricultural traditions developing entirely independently, with no possible contact or cultural exchange between these widely separated regions during this specific historical period. This detail is worth appreciating specifically, because it represents one of the most compelling examples throughout this entire series regarding independent human technological convergence. Different populations facing broadly comparable underlying environmental and demographic pressures arrived at strikingly similar fundamental solutions, deliberately cultivating specific plant species rather than relying purely on wild food sources, entirely independently, and without any possible shared cultural transmission between these completely separate regions and populations. Let's talk about additional independent agricultural centers beyond the ones already discussed too, because this represents important additional evidence worth exploring specifically, further reinforcing just how widespread and independent this broader pattern actually proved to be. Researchers have also confirmed independent agricultural development in New Guinea, where early humans independently domesticated bananas, taro, and sugarcane, along with independent development in parts of sub Saharan Africa specifically, where early humans domesticated crops including sorghum and African rice varieties, distinct from the Asian rice varieties already discussed regarding China specifically. This additional evidence further reinforces the broader pattern already established throughout this discussion, demonstrating that agricultural development occurred independently across an even wider range of separate world regions than the initial core examples already discussed might otherwise suggest, extending this remarkable pattern of independent human technological convergence across an even more geographically extensive range of separate, unconnected populations. Let's talk about the specific competing theories researchers have proposed to explain exactly why agriculture developed when and where it did, because this represents an important, actively debated area of ongoing scholarly research worth exploring in additional depth. Beyond the general climate and population pressure factors already discussed extensively throughout this topic, researchers have proposed several more specific theoretical frameworks, including what's sometimes called the oasis theory, proposing that specific regional climate changes concentrated both humans and wild plant and animal populations around increasingly limited water sources, creating unusually close, sustained proximity that eventually favored deliberate cultivation and domestication. Other researchers have proposed alternative theoretical frameworks emphasizing social and competitive factors within increasingly complex hunter-gatherer societies, suggesting agriculture may have initially developed partly as a means of producing surplus food specifically for social or ceremonial purposes, rather than purely as a direct response to basic survival necessity alone. This ongoing theoretical debate is worth acknowledging honestly, since researchers don't currently share complete unanimous agreement regarding the precise relative importance of these various different proposed explanatory factors. Let's talk about the specific genetic changes domestication actually produced within cultivated plants too, because this represents a scientifically detailed, particularly interesting dimension worth exploring in additional depth. Researchers studying plant genetics have identified specific genetic changes distinguishing domesticated crop varieties from their wild ancestor plants, including changes affecting seed size, seed retention, meaning domesticated varieties tend to hold onto their seeds rather than naturally scattering them the way wild plants typically do, and various other traits specifically making cultivated plants easier to successfully harvest and replant using deliberate human effort and cultivation technique. This detailed genetic evidence allows researchers to trace domestication's specific genetic timeline with considerable scientific precision, confirming that this process generally unfolded gradually across many generations rather than representing any kind of single, sudden genetic transformation occurring within a brief historical time frame. Let's talk about wheat and barley domestication in the Fertile Crescent specifically in additional detail too, because grounding this discussion in this particularly well-studied specific example helps illustrate the broader domestication process already discussed in more concrete, specific terms. Wild wheat and barley. Varieties native to the Fertile Crescent region naturally scatter their seeds once fully ripened. An effective wild reproductive strategy, but a considerable practical inconvenience for anyone attempting to harvest and replant these specific seeds through deliberate human cultivation. Early Fertile Crescent farmers gradually selected and cultivated specific plant variants that retained their seeds somewhat longer, making deliberate harvesting considerably more practical and efficient, gradually shifting the overall cultivated plant population toward this specific seed retention trait across many successive growing seasons and plant generations. Let's talk about how agriculture connects to broader questions regarding early human property concepts and social organization too, because this represents an important, closely related social dimension worth exploring specifically. The development of agriculture likely contributed directly to evolving concepts regarding land ownership and inheritance. Since agricultural land, unlike the more broadly shared hunting and gathering territories typical of earlier hunter-gatherer societies, required sustained, ongoing individual or family investment in a specific fixed plot of land across multiple successive growing seasons. This detail connects directly to broader questions already explored extensively in other discussions regarding the emergence of increasingly complex social hierarchy and property concepts, suggesting agriculture likely played a direct foundational role in these broader evolving social and economic developments, extending well beyond simply the direct food production changes already discussed extensively throughout the rest of this topic. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about the specific archaeological sites that have proven particularly significant for confirming this broader agricultural timeline, too, because grounding this discussion in concrete archaeological examples helps illustrate the actual physical evidence supporting everything already discussed throughout this topic. Sites including Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, already discussed in other explorations of ancient monumental architecture, and various other Fertile Crescent settlement sites have yielded detailed archaeological evidence directly documenting this gradual transition from hunting and gathering toward increasingly established agricultural practice, including preserved plant remains showing the gradual genetic and physical changes already discussed extensively throughout this topic, occurring in careful, documented sequence across successive archaeological layers representing different specific historical time periods. Let's talk about the specific process of plant domestication itself, because understanding this underlying biological process helps illustrate just how gradual and how technically sophisticated this transition actually proved to be. Domestication involved humans gradually selecting and cultivating plant varieties, showing specific desirable traits, larger seeds, easier harvesting, more reliable growth patterns, gradually shaping these cultivated plant populations across many successive generations into increasingly distinct domesticated varieties considerably different from their original wild ancestor plants. This process required considerable accumulated practical knowledge and patient, sustained effort across many generations, rather than representing any kind of single, sudden discovery or invention occurring within a single person's lifetime. Let's talk about animal domestication as a closely related parallel development too, because this represents an important, complementary dimension of this broader agricultural transition worth exploring specifically. Alongside plant cultivation already discussed extensively throughout this topic, early humans also began domesticating various animal species during this same general historical period, including sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs, providing reliable sources of meat, milk, and other valuable animal products, alongside labor for agricultural work itself in certain specific cases. This parallel development of animal domestication occurred alongside, and closely complemented, the plant cultivation already discussed, together representing the complete package of practices researchers generally refer to when discussing the broader agricultural revolution. Let's talk about the seriously significant social and demographic consequences. Agriculture's development actually produced too, because this represents an essential dimension worth exploring in additional depth, extending well beyond simply the direct food production changes already discussed extensively throughout this topic. Agriculture enabled dramatically increased food production per unit of land compared to hunting and gathering, supporting considerably higher population density, and eventually permanent settlement in fixed locations rather than the mobile, seasonally variable settlement patterns typical of hunter-gatherer societies, already explored extensively in other discussions regarding early human social organization. This transition towards settled agricultural life eventually enabled the development of considerably larger, more complex human settlements, eventually including cities, along with increasingly complex social and political organization, connecting directly to broader questions already explored extensively in other discussions regarding early human civilization and technological development more generally. Let's talk about the genuine health trade-offs agriculture's adoption actually involved too, because it's worth acknowledging honestly that this transition, despite its enormous long-term significance for human civilization, wasn't purely unambiguously beneficial for the actual individual humans experiencing this transition firsthand. Archaeological evidence from skeletal remains suggests early agricultural populations frequently experienced measurably reduced average height and other indicators of reduced nutritional quality compared to hunter-gatherer populations, likely connected to the considerably less varied diet many early agricultural societies relied upon compared to the broader range of different wild food sources hunter-gatherer societies typically incorporated into their more varied diet. This detail is worth including because it complicates any simple, purely celebratory narrative regarding agriculture's development, suggesting this transition, while ultimately enabling the population growth and social complexity that eventually produced modern human civilization, initially involved genuine nutritional and health trade-offs for the actual individual humans living through this specific historical transition, illustrating a considerably more complicated historical reality worth appreciating honestly, rather than presenting agriculture's development as an unambiguous, purely beneficial historical achievement without any accompanying complication or cost. Let's talk about how these separately domesticated crops eventually spread and combined across the world too, because this represents an important, historically significant later chapter worth exploring specifically before continuing this broader discussion. Following the initial period of independent domestication already discussed extensively throughout this topic, these various separately domesticated crops gradually spread through trade and migration, eventually reaching considerably wider global distribution well beyond their original specific region of independent domestication. This process accelerated dramatically following extended global contact beginning particularly in the 15th century, when previously separate agricultural traditions from the Americas, Europe, Asia, and Africa suddenly came into sustained direct contact, producing what historians sometimes refer to as a significant global agricultural exchange, fundamentally reshaping diets and agricultural practices across virtually every populated region of the world within a relatively compressed historical timeframe compared to the many thousands of years the original independent domestication process itself had actually required. Let's talk about the connection between agriculture and infectious disease, too, because this represents an important, often underappreciated consequence worth exploring specifically. The transition towards settled agricultural life and, importantly, close, sustained proximity to domesticated animals created new opportunities for infectious diseases to develop and spread between animal populations and humans, with researchers connecting numerous significant historical infectious diseases directly to this specific transition toward agricultural life and sustained animal domestication. This detail adds another important dimension to the broader trade-off picture already established throughout this discussion, suggesting agriculture's development, alongside the nutritional trade-offs already discussed, also introduced new disease-related challenges that hunter-gatherer populations, generally living in smaller, more mobile groups with less sustained animal proximity, hadn't previously needed to navigate and manage to nearly the same considerable extent. Let's talk about modern crop diversity and its direct connection back to these original domestication centers too, because this represents a fitting, contemporary connection worth exploring before this discussion concludes. The world's major modern staple crops, wheat, rice, maize, and potatoes specifically among them, all trace their specific genetic origin directly back to these original, independently developed domestication centers already discussed extensively throughout this topic, meaning the vast majority of calories modern humans worldwide actually consume today ultimately derives from crop varieties, first domesticated by early human populations working entirely independently across these several separate world regions many thousands of years ago. This detail is worth appreciating because it demonstrates just how directly and how completely modern global agriculture and food systems remain connected to these ancient, independently developed agricultural traditions, despite the enormous span of subsequent historical time and technological development separating modern industrial agriculture from its original ancient roots and foundations. Let's talk about ongoing archaeological and genetic research continuing to refine this broader picture too, because it's worth acknowledging honestly, before wrapping up this discussion, that meaningful research continues actively developing in this specific area. Researchers continue identifying new archaeological sites and refining genetic analysis techniques, occasionally revising specific details regarding exactly when and how domestication occurred within particular regions already discussed extensively throughout this topic, representing a normal, healthy feature of ongoing active scientific research rather than any fundamental uncertainty regarding the core, well-established conclusion that agriculture developed independently across multiple separate world regions, a conclusion supported by such extensive, consistent archaeological and genetic evidence that it remains one of the most solidly established findings within the broader field of archaeological and agricultural history research. Let's talk about how researchers actually study and confirm this agricultural development timeline too, because this represents an important methodological consideration worth addressing directly. Researchers rely on a combination of archaeological evidence, including preserved plant remains, and specialized agricultural tools found at ancient settlement sites, alongside genetic analysis comparing modern domesticated crop varieties against their wild ancestor plants, allowing researchers to trace the specific genetic changes associated with domestication and estimate roughly when these specific genetic changes likely occurred. This combination of archaeological and genetic evidence has allowed researchers to construct an increasingly detailed, increasingly confident picture of exactly when and how agriculture developed independently across these multiple separate world regions. Let's talk briefly about how this ancient history connects to contemporary agricultural sustainability discussions too, because this represents a fitting, forward-looking final connection worth including before this discussion concludes. Contemporary researchers studying sustainable agriculture and food security increasingly draw on detailed historical and archaeological understanding of these original domestication processes, recognizing that the genetic diversity present within wild ancestor plant populations, closely related to but genetically distinct from the narrower range of modern commercial crop varieties actually cultivated at scale today, represents a valuable genetic resource worth carefully preserving and studying, potentially offering useful genetic traits relevant to developing more resilient, more sustainable crop varieties, better suited to addressing contemporary agricultural challenges including climate change and evolving pest and disease pressures. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full story of when humans invented agriculture turns out to reveal a considerably more gradual, considerably more geographically distributed development than the popular, simplified narrative often suggests. Agriculture first developed roughly 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent specifically, but crucially, it also developed independently across several other completely separate world regions, including China, Mesoamerica, and South America, each population arriving at broadly similar fundamental solutions entirely independently. This transition, while ultimately enabling the population growth, settled civilization, and social complexity that eventually produced modern human society, also involved real, documented health trade-offs for the specific individual humans actually experiencing this transition firsthand. So the next time you sit down for an ordinary meal, it's worth appreciating that you're benefiting from a foundational human transition that occurred independently across multiple separate regions roughly 12,000 years ago, representing one of the most significant, really transformative developments in our entire species' history. Even though this same transition initially involved real complication and trade-off for the actual humans who first experienced it directly, which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If something as fundamental to modern civilization as agriculture actually developed independently across multiple, completely separate regions, each population arriving at broadly similar solutions without any possible contact or shared cultural transmission, what does that suggest about how predictably human societies tend to respond to similar underlying environmental and demographic pressures, regardless of which specific culture or region actually happens to be facing those particular circumstances?